Ladies and gentlemen, good evening to all of you and welcome. I'm Jack Ford, one of the hosts of WNET's magazine program, Metro Focus, and I'm delighted to be here and to welcome all of you and also to welcome the folks that are joining us by way of their Zoom platform. We're happy that all of you can be here. We want to take a little time to continue some of the conversations and the themes from the film. I'm delighted that so many of you have seen so much of it already. I had the great good fortune to spend an extended period of time interviewing Ken Burns and also Sarah Botstein a few weeks ago before this came out. And one of the things that Ken said to me, interestingly, is that he hoped the film would generate these types of conversations among people. So I sent him a note, as a matter of fact, this morning saying, at least here your hopes are coming true. So we want to encourage you all, certainly those of you who have started watching, if others haven't had a chance, to make sure you get to PBS and have an opportunity to watch this. It's almost impossible to understate the importance of understanding what happened so many years ago and realizing that, what did Faulkner say, the past is not even past. So that understanding becomes essential for us. We're delighted to have three folks joining us here who have very compelling and interesting perspectives about all of this. And they're going to share some of those perspectives in the conversation that I'll drive. Then we'll have a little bit of time at the end. Hopefully some of you will have some questions you want to pose to them, perhaps some of the folks on the Zoom platform also. And we want to take a look through these individual perspectives of some of the thoughts and the themes that have arisen from the film. Not only about looking back, but also looking forward here. So we're delighted to have with us first next to me, Daniel Mendelson, who's a professor and author of many things, including the award-winning and acclaimed Holocaust family saga titled The Loss, A Search for 6 of 6 Million. I want to note for you, it is a marvelous and compelling book. It reads as if it's well-researched, well-written mystery, but in fact, it's all true, and I do want to note for you that it will be available for sale after this, and it's well worth your taking a read for that. And you saw Daniel is featured throughout the course of the film here. Also in the middle, we have Dr. Deborah Schmidt-Bach, who's the curator of decorative arts and special exhibitions at the New York Historical Society. Her Confronting Hate 1937 to 1952 exhibit, which highlights the American Jewish Committee's groundbreaking campaign to combat anti-Semitism, currently on exhibit at the New York Historical Society. Deborah, welcome to you also. And on the far end, we have Dr. Shai Pilnick, who is the director of the MLA and Jenny Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Yeshiva University. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for spending a little time with us. Daniel, let me start with you. And I tried to give a brief outline of your book. Essentially, it was your quest to look back towards a maternal great uncle, his wife, and 4 children to find out what happened to them. How did that quest by you, that resulted in this marvelous book, how did that impact your understanding of what this film is focusing on, which is the U.S. and the Holocaust?
Well, my family story, unfortunately, is like most of the stories of European victims of the Holocaust. You see in these few excerpts that you've seen this evening a parade of survivors who managed to get to the United States. And as I never tire of reminding people, if you're talking to a survivor, you're talking to an unrepresentative sample in this event, and one should always keep that in mind. My great uncle, my grandfather's brother, and his wife and their 4 teenage children were trapped in Poland and trying to get out, and like almost everyone else in that situation, they thought that the United States would be a haven for them. And my great uncle was writing letters to my grandfather and the other siblings who had already come to the United States in the 1920s, asking for help. He said he was writing letters to President Roosevelt, Nebuch. So I think that their plight unfortunately, almost in this film, they they have to represent a lot of people. But I think it's important to remember that although you see about 5 or 6 survivors and they're incredibly eloquent and touching, the testimony that they give, they're unrepresentative of what happened, because most of the people, remember the statistic you see at the beginning, 2 out of every 3 Jews in Europe was murdered. And, although Hitler lost the war, his project was largely successful. One has to remember that. So I think my family intersects with Ken's story because, if the United States had acted differently, who knows? They might have had a chance, but they didn't have a chance.
Why do you think, and clearly telling the stories of those who did manage to survive is so important, but why do you think it's also so important to tell the stories of those who didn't survive?
Well, look, as we know, these people were deliberately erased in a way that was intended to erase their identities and their histories. So my personal quest was to try to give faces to what have become statistics. And of course, the statistics of this event are so staggering that they become difficult to conceptualize, right? You can't, I remember when 9/11 happened and there was initially, they thought 10,000 people had died. And I remember I was talking to a friend of mine, she said, you can't even imagine what 10,000 people is like. And I thought, you certainly can't imagine what 6 million people is like, right? And so one of the things I was trying to do in my book is to remind you that, you could write a 500-page book about every family that was killed, and it still wouldn't be enough testimony. So to particularize, to these sort of cliches, for lack of a better word, that we know about the Shoah, right? The gas chambers, the mountains of eyeglasses, the luggage, these have become symbols, and they're powerful symbols, but no one is a symbol to themselves. No one is a statistic to themselves. And one always has to be reminded as much as possible of the human reality of every single one of those people, which of course is impossible, but at least to have that in mind, I think, is an important thing.
One of the things you talk about is you describe it as the relationship between memory and truth. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I wrote, my book was published in 2006. I couldn't predict then how problematic the truth would become because of all the reasons we know. Social media, fake news, blah, blah, blah. But, I wanted my book to essentially be an oral history of people who could not speak any longer for themselves. And when you're talking to people, there are very famous problems. I mean, not that, there are people who intentionally misrepresent, but there's also, when you're interviewing survivors, you're interviewing people who have been exposed to extreme forms of trauma. And so some of them have told their story so many times that you want to sort of get underneath the narrative that has become habitual to them and try to bring back the sort of the sticky details, So I think everything about this event, look, the famous issue of the Holocaust, particularly as it recedes further in time and it becomes more the property of people to whom it did not happen than people to whom it did happen, is representation. This is the famous thing. How do you represent an event this colossal, this staggering, that goes to this level of depravity and extremity? So I always think it's important to remember that one has to distinguish between, it's the Rashomon thing, right? It's the famous thing. You have 7 people telling the same story. Everyone's going to be a little different. And these things are important, particularly now in an atmosphere where there are evil people in high places who are actively working to distort the truth, to denigrate the truth, to misrepresent the truth. So I think these questions about the subtleties of how we understand the truth, how do we know what was true, how do we know what happened, are particularly important.
Shai, let me ask you to help us understand a little bit more some of what we saw in the excerpts here. And specifically, give us a better sense of how the Americans' opinions of the Holocaust, we didn't call it that then, but the information that was emerging. How did American opinion change from the early days to the later days when people were able to see the graphic video evidence of it?
Well, I believe when people see the graphic evidence that we just saw at the end of the documentary, we're talking about soldiers that we today, in hindsight, call liberators. That's not immediately the entire population of America. The liberators, of course, receive this glorified title in hindsight, but all too often they come upon labor camps, prison camps, where they don't exactly understand what's going on. They don't exactly know who these people are, what they're doing there, and they are not necessarily, not in all cases, they are on a mission to liberate them. And when they see them, the immediate reaction is shock. Now we have to remember that the liberation of death camps, for the most part, is done by the Soviets. So the Soviets, the Red Army, is liberating camps. They liberate Auschwitz. They liberate Majdanek, which actually the Nazis flee and remains almost completely preserved. There's actually a gas chamber that still exists in what today is the Majdanek Museum. So we definitely see their view as evolving. I think the movie, for the most part, the movie will be subject to debate. The movie is made by a brilliant filmmaker who makes documentary films, who was consulted by many historians. Some of the evidence presented here will continue to be debated. I think that the comfort zone, you can detect by my accent that I wasn't born in the Hudson Valley, right? or northern Nebraska. So I'm a grandson of Holocaust survivors who immigrated to Israel. I would say about a decade after the end of World War II. And I think that from my experience speaking to Americans, there is a comfort zone of knowing that the State Department had some anti-Semites, that there were people, that America in general was more anti-Semitic. We know there was a march of the Ku Klux Klan in the 20s, and we actually see changes in a positive way in American society. I found out that FDR is a very sensitive issue. If we read Raphael Madoff's recent book about FDR and the Jews, we get a picture that he does not, completely he's not completely off the hook here. So we really talk about some levels of collusion with the Nazi regime of government, State Department, Senate, and also the American population. And it's a very complex issue. Roosevelt supports the war effort, even before America joins the war.
Let me ask you that question, because that was the one that I wanted to ask you next, and you led me nicely to it. I think some of the more disturbing statistics, and when I talked with Ken Burns, he mentioned this to me. We heard in one of the excerpts where they talked about polls showing, for whatever value polls have, 84% of Catholics objected to bringing in Jewish refugees, 85% of Protestants, and 25% of Jewish residents. What were the factors that were taking place at the time that you think contributed to these barriers, to saying, come here to safety?
Isolationism, recovery from the depression, and I would also say, and this is my take, I think human beings are not inclined to be extremely hospitable and to bring on board hundreds of thousands of people who are penurious, who have no skills and do not have a language. That's why I also say that I was a little bit unnerved. It is easy for us, again, going to the comfort zone, to think about the ideal immigrant of Anne Frank and what she could be as an upper middle class Jew from Germany moving to Holland. She would probably come here and I wish that was true. Within a few years, she could receive an undergraduate degree from a good liberal arts college. The majority of the Jews did not fit by any way, shape, or form the demographic, social, religious characteristics of Anne Frank, who is presented in the movie. So there is always xenophobia, coupled also by anti-Semitism. We have to remember that anti-Semitism existed in America since the birth of this nation, and has never really dies. Sometimes it raises its ugly face. Sometimes we manage to, keep calm. Sometimes it scares us when I talk about the Jewish community. And that explains to me why there was no willingness to admit them. Just a side note, in Palestine, which was about to become the nation in building, which was about to become the state of Israel, there's more reluctance than we know today to admit people who do not have any skills, any language. So Palestine, as a potential future Jewish state, at least for the labor movement that built the country, was a small country that had very small capacity to absorb these refugees.
Deborah, let me come to you. And again, the exhibit I mentioned before, Confronting Hate, 1937-1952, it highlights the American Jewish Committee's media campaign to combat anti-Semitism. Why did they feel this need to get out in front of this and to combat it? And how did they go about doing that?
The American Jewish Committee had been very aware of the xenophobia that was going on in the United States in the 1920s and 1930s. And it was a combination of many different things, including the Johnson-Reed Act, which limited immigration, particularly from Eastern Europe, where a lot of Jewish migrants were coming from. Activity by groups like the Ku Klux Klan, or individuals like Henry Ford or Father Coughlin, promoting lies, essentially, and anti-Semitic rumors. And so the American Jewish Committee had done a survey in 1937, and they were noticing that there were anti-Semitic events happening in New York. And so that was part of the impetus behind creating a campaign that would be addressed to Americans and would help Americans to understand what anti-Semitism is and to fight anti-Semitism. So the American Jewish Committee determined that they needed somebody well-versed in advertising to take on this campaign. And so they brought in a man named Richard Rothschild, who had been a Madison Avenue advertising executive. And Rothschild had a very interesting perspective on the way the campaign should work. For one thing, Rothschild felt very strongly that the campaign should not address specific anti-Semitic attacks, but instead counter those attacks by explaining ways in which American Jews were active in the United States and also working in cooperation with Christians. The other thing that he felt very strongly about is that the campaign should be a mass media campaign and should address as many Americans as they possibly could. So in 1937, that means using new technologies like radio, or new forms of entertainment like comic books. And so Rothschild assembled a team, so there were a team of 3 people, a man named Milton Krentz, who was a radio man, and a woman named Ethel Phillips, who initially came as a copy editor for 2 weeks and then stayed for 18 years. And they really worked very hard to create a campaign that would address Americans and teach them why anti-Semitism is not a good thing. The other thing that Rothschild felt was very important is that anti-Semitism to him was a symptom of American bias in general. And that was his approach from the beginning. he felt very strongly that anti-Semitism was just one of many types of American biases. And so initially, the campaign begins by addressing anti-Semitism and by looking at some of the different white supremacist groups and anti-Semitic groups and their activities in the United States, but also in the New York area. But the campaign quickly evolves to take on a wide range of American biases. And by the 1940s, that included civil rights.
Is it possible to assess how effective that campaign was?
I don't know that there were many studies done in terms of the receipt of these messages, but the AJC was very careful in terms of making sure that they were sending these messages, and the messages generally went out in the form of cartoons, newspaper advertisements or stories, magazine stories, radio shows. So they were very, very conscious of the numbers, of the circulation numbers of every newspaper or radio outlet that they were sending these messages across to. And that was a very, very important part of the campaign. The other thing that they did was that they enlisted a very large group of allies, and they used that, we hear that word a lot now, but they used that word allies. So they enlisted organizations like labor unions, church and women's organizations, the veterans of foreign wars. There was a very large range of allies who were working with the AJC. And so together, there were a set of different initiatives that campaign could create and bring out to as many Americans as possible.
One or two more questions I want to ask each of you specifically about the film and what it represents. And then I've got some sort of bigger today questions that I want to wrap up our conversation with. But Daniel, let me come back to you. And there is a quote that you use in the film. And you say the fragility of civilized behavior is the one thing you really learn from this. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's the thing we're obviously all thinking about quite a lot right now, but you know, the Holocaust could not happen without a collapse of civilized norms on an individual level, right? And as my great friend Froma Zeitlin always said when we were schlepping around Eastern Europe doing the research for my book, you know, we tend again to think of these things as abstractions, you know, the gas chambers, the trains, the cattle cars. But she said, remember, someone had to agree to drive the train. You know, someone had to press a button in the gas chamber. All of these things come back to individual acts. And what one learns studying this event, I'm not a historian, I'm an amateur historian, but when you study this event, even in any depth, is that people will start doing very bad things in the right combination of circumstances, and one of those, which we have seen recently, is when someone in a position of authority says it's okay to be shameless. That, to me, is the key thing. It's okay. Things that you secretly, you know, resentments, hatreds, those things which you bury in the normal course of things. Someone suddenly says it's okay to express those. That has to take place, and it doesn't take a lot, as it turns out, you know, and that I think is very important to remember. That's from the perpetrator's side, right? You get bad people. Look, these people, I talked to them, I interviewed them. They're a famous killer in my family's town. They called him the Butcher. Terrible, terrible thing. And it turns out, which I could never process, I always thought of him as a kind of middle-aged, porky, evil-looking, piggy-eyed guy. He was a 19-year-old boy who had just become a Ukrainian policeman, perpetrating terrible things. And he went to church on Sundays. He would kill Jewish grandmothers on Thursday, and he would go to church. He would go to the Ukrainian church. So people tell themselves all kinds of things, and they still do terrible things. From the other side, you know, one of my survivors told me, I always quote it, he says, 2 weeks of fear and hunger, and people will start to do anything. 2 weeks, he said to me. And that's important to go. So you know, we've seen this so much recently, but, you know, civilization rests on, you know, impalpable conventions, and they're purely conventions. We agree to pay our taxes most of the time. You know, we agree to stop at red lights. We agree, you know, all these things. And then when somebody says, nah, you don't have to do that anymore, it all falls apart.
Deborah, do you see what might be a troubling irony here in the comparison between what the committee did, right, back in the 30s into the 40s and the early 50s to get that message out, and what we're seeing now in terms of hate groups and extremist groups and the mechanisms that they are using to get their messages out?
Yeah, I think that the hate groups in the 30s were using current media and technologies. Somebody like Father Coughlin, who had a radio show and was using that radio show as a platform to offer, you know, what were essentially lies about Jews to the American people. So I do see parallels, that there are the bad side and the good sides can use new technologies. But one of the things that that moved me about working with the AJC material is that Richard Rothschild's philosophy was that this should be an optimistic campaign and an optimistic view of what is possible in the United States. So I find that very interesting, and in looking at in reading the newspaper, frankly, today, because there's a lot of publicity about what the bad side is doing, what different supremacist groups are doing, and the kinds of media that they're engaged in. But it's important to remember that media can be used for good as well. And I think that if there's one takeaway that I took from working on that exhibition, is that it's not just the bad that's being transmitted on media. There's also a place for the good to be transmitted as well.
Shai, as someone who has studied this, when you look at the response of the U.S. to the Holocaust, the response of the U.S. to these pleas, to please open your doors, let us come, at least let the children come, and we know how troubling that response was. Are there lessons that we should be learning from those situations that we can apply to today's situations dealing with immigration issues and genocides that we are seeing taking place in a number of far too many locations in the world?
So the foundation of the field of Holocaust education, in distinction from Holocaust studies. In Holocaust studies, we research the history of the Holocaust. In Holocaust education, we talk normally to middle school, high school students, and we speak about the lessons drawn from it. Like any other historical event, and I will express now an inconvenient truth, history itself does not teach us any lessons. It is the human beings who study history that may be able, if they wish to, and based on their values, to derive historical lessons. Our society is divided, and splitting along political lines, different groups and different people will always find it convenient to draw their own lessons. If you ask me personally, what is the key lesson of our era, I would actually say gravitation towards the middle, gravitation towards moderation. In Germany, there were a lot of anti-Semites decades before the Nazis came to power. And still, Jews managed to live quite, successfully in the fancy suburbs of Hamburg and Berlin without being harassed, even though, by the way, it took them years to be able to become doctors and lawyers and professors at universities. So what we see today is, first of all, two extremist groups that threaten to, I would say, that are shaking the foundations of our society. Speaking to my American friends and colleagues, there is always, especially in the Jewish community, there is an alarm about neo-Nazi extremist groups When I travel to Israel, people always ask me, what about anti-Semitism in America? How is it like when you have so much anti-Semitism on campuses, on university campuses, where they see the anti-Semitism expresses itself in an attack against the only state that the Jewish people has? So I would say that the key, before I talk about genocide and about immigration, that to me the key is to be able to talk to each other, to be able to agree to disagree, and be able to go back to the years when we could disagree with each other and still empathize with the other and have a civil discussion like we have now, I think. And if Ken Burns wanted this movie to trigger a good discussion, there we go. When you ask me about immigration, I don't know if there's a certain immigration policy that I would derive from the film. I think that genocide, the problem with genocide and the term genocide is that it's normally defined after the fact. We established that there's genocide that just went on. But I would say that our politicians, our leaders, and the people who vote for them should always remember, when possible, to show compassion, to think about other people, to think about their plight, and to do the best to help them and support them. And I think that goodwill should characterize people on both aisles and across all echelons of our society.
If I can,
Go ahead.
I think in this country there is a special, speaking of education, which we all hope for, and this country has a special problem, which I've become familiar with more and more. And watching, I think one of the great points about this documentary is it explains the basis of this problem, which is Americans as a nation have an ideological delusion that we are the good guys of history. And although the country is founded on a genocide and operated on slavery for 200 years, we still think we're better than everybody else. And that, it sounds funny, but it's not funny, because we think that, we cannot recognize the nature of things that are happening which are extremely sinister, because we keep thinking, well, but this is America. We don't do those kinds of things, when in fact we have done exactly those kinds of things. And one encounters this. I have a sense of incredulity reading the responses to some recent events, and people don't recognize them for what they are. And I think that's a real stumbling block for education in a way that, at least until recently, I think the Germans have done a better job at examining their dark histories than we have, actually. A symbol of that is that on our National Mall, which is the architectural expression of our national ideology, there is a museum to the Holocaust, an event that did not take place here, and in which we like to think we are the, as you were saying, Shai, the liberators, as flawed as that may be. And there is no museum to slavery. There's no museum to slavery. So that says something about how we think of ourselves, and that is a terrible obstacle to education.
There's so many more questions I'd like to pose, but we wanted to save some time for some questions from you folks. And I think we have somebody.
We have one right here.
Here we go.
Okay, I'll try to be brief because I know so many people want to speak. Thank you for the book Lost. I am first-generation American, daughter of Holocaust survivors. So you put faces because they were from Eastern Poland. I have no information. So thank you for that. I'm going to use first names because I've got last names. Deborah. I watched a program yesterday in partnership with another organization called First Jews in America, and it was brilliant. I missed the last 20 minutes. If you could somehow make that available, it's from the New York Historical Society.
It was from the First Jewish Americans exhibition. Yes, yes.
It's brilliant, and I think not enough Americans and Jews in particular know enough about the Jews that came here
Yes, absolutely.
During colonial times, and we need to educate ourselves about. We've been here for a long time.
Absolutely, and that's one of the reasons that we did that exhibition. That was a 2016 exhibition.
Right, but the virtual exhibition is marvelous, and I missed the last 20 minutes. So if you can make that available.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
And my last comment, I'm going to be done. Thank you, Rabbi, for coming. My husband's a graduate of Yeshiva University. Got his doctorate
I'm actually another rabbi, but continue.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Shai. He got his doctorate there. And it is a very diverse population. So I think we have to look to our own institutions and educational systems to kind of promote the lack of biases in all facets of the American population. That's all I'm going to say.
Do you have a question? You have a question?
Thank you. We have seen historic photographs that have shown us Jewish peddlers and tailors and doctors and lawyers possibly. But also important, and we don't talk enough about it, is what we don't see, and those are the children who were killed and the lives that weren't lived and the possibilities that didn't happen. How can we bring this forward to more people, this issue? Thank you.
Somebody want to jump on that?
I mean, one of the things that we're doing is we spend all of our exhibition time trying to educate people about various facets of history that we need to examine and hopefully learn from. And actually spent a lot of today working with our educators on the Confronting Hate exhibition to figure out how we're going to impart the story of the campaign to school children. And so we're just working very hard to bring out whatever programs we're doing, and including exhibitions, to put them online, to send them around the country. You know, that's one of the tacks that we're taking.
See if we have some others.
Gonna come over here.
Work this side of the room.
Okay, I like to tell you about American Jews in the time of the Holocaust, the Shoah. Well, I'm not going to excuse them, but the 25% who against it, it's happening everywhere and all the time, but they didn't know what was really there. That's one thing. The other thing, it's nothing ever was before and after the Holocaust. That's why I don't like it when everybody say genocide and people get killed here, killed there, but never systematically. The Jews was happened to be dead even before they was born, just because they have Jewish blood. That's never before like that. In the Inquisition.
Is there a question part of this?
No, I want to tell you. In
I'm
the
sorry,
Inquisition.
This is the question part of the Q&A. So we're going to go around and ask
Okay.
if anyone else has any questions
No,
for the panelists.
Okay, I just want to tell you one thing. When it was the Inquisition, if I would say, I'm not going to be Jewish anymore, I could survive. If I would say, great Hitler, but I'm Jewish, they still would kill me.
So I will respond, knowing that this is not a question, but a comment, that the definition of genocide is still subject to debate. For Raphael Lemkin, genocide was deliberately very broadly defined, and we know that the UN Convention on Genocide came up with the definition that genocide is the attack in whole or in part. In other words, very vague language where even if you kill you murder a certain ethnic group only partially, that can count as a genocide. And that's why, from that point of view, the Holocaust of European Jewry is distinct. It's an unprecedented, unique event in history in which one group purported to launch the most comprehensive genocide ever, claiming that every single person who is born Jewish already has that that defect that deserves their eradication.
We have a question here in the middle, if you wouldn't mind passing that.
Hi. First of all, thank you for putting this on. I think it's really helpful to have a sort of curated showing of the documentary. I did watch the very first episode. I happen to be the daughter of Holocaust survivors. My mother, she was one of the lucky ones who went from Auschwitz to slave labor because she could work, and so she managed to survive. But I grew up with it. I grew up with survivors. I have been immersed in everything, you know, from the get-go. And, okay, so the question is, why does this documentary and PBS in general, and I will nod to the good professor here who mentioned it, only state that anti-Semitism and hate comes from white supremacy, the far right, and completely just ignore the very real anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, anti-Israelism that is making life very difficult for Jews in America.
But
as
that's
well
an
as
easy
other
question
places.
to answer because the film is about a period before Israel existed.
No, that's not a good answer because
Well, I think it is. You can't blame the
It's
film.
it's
You
his
can't blame-
answer.
Zionism existed, and it existed then too. So no, that's isolating the issue and not.
Well, you said
addressing-
anti-Israelism, so I don't know how you could be anti-Israel before there's an Israel. But I think anyway, the film does a very good job of laying out the extent of American anti-Semitism before the war, which is what it's about.
We have another. We have
I
another.
think we have time for one last question
All right, one.
here.
And a question, please. All right.
In Jewish community events, the Q&A section never has any questions, trust me. I've done them for so many years. That's the beauty of it, right?
Thank you. My question has to do with lessons learned, the panelists, as to what lessons you think we learned that were reflected in the decade after this movie ends in the United States in terms of perhaps the biases we have. I think of the mass media film, The House I Live In, with Frank Sinatra, which won or was nominated for an Academy Award. But within 10 years, we had McCarthy hearings. We also had an anti-lynching committee that was with Jews and blacks involved. So I was wondering if there are any lessons we can learn from lessons that were learned and reflected within the few years following the
That's a
Holocaust
perfect
event.
last question, by
Can
the
I,
way.
can I
to wrap
jump
up.
in with
Deb?
that? So the last poster in our exhibition is a poster that was published in 1947 after the president's report on civil rights was released. And the poster basically says, it's a great country, and the next line says, but we've got to do better. And I look at that poster every day, and I just think we've got to do better. And for me, that's really summarized what I've learned in the last several years, but particularly in working on this exhibition.
We could talk forever. But unfortunately, we have some time constraints. But I do want to say this as I thank our panelists. There are generally two goals for these types of conversations. The first is that they're informative, that at the end of this conversation you say, you know what, I learned something that I didn't know before. Or perhaps you say, I have a better understanding of something than I had before. And the other, and this might even be more important, is that these conversations make us think. And I hope that you'll all agree that our panelists today, Shai, Deborah, and Daniel, did indeed provide us with wonderful information, and they made us think about these very difficult issues. So our thanks to them for their participation.
I'm honored. Thank you. Thank you.
And our thanks to all of you and for the organizations that participated and for your participation tonight. Also, those of you joining us on Zoom, thank you. Be safe. Have a good night.